The morning sun barely pierced the gray haze outside the Miller family's suburban kitchen, casting weak shadows across the chipped countertop where David Miller stood, his broad shoulders hunched over a lukewarm cup of coffee. His tie hung loose around his neck, a faint coffee stain blooming near the knot from a spill he hadn't noticed until it was too late. The air carried the acrid scent of burnt toast, mingling with the sticky sweetness of orange juice pooling beneath Sophie's high chair, where the 6-year-old had abandoned her breakfast to scribble crayons across a dog-eared coloring book. Emily, 12 and perpetually exasperated, sat at the table with her nose buried in her phone, her dark hair falling like a curtain over her face, while Jack, 9, sprawled across the floor, his sneakers scuffing the linoleum as he built a wobbly tower of Legos. This was David's life, 38 years distilled into a relentless cycle of school drop-offs, engineering deadlines, and the dull hum of domesticity. He'd grown accustomed to the monotony, even found comfort in its predictability, until the moment his fingers brushed against something unexpected in Anna's purse. He'd been searching for his car keys, his mind already halfway to the office where a stack of blueprints awaited his scrutiny. Anna had breezed through the kitchen moments earlier, her heels clicking with purpose, her blouse crisp, and her blonde hair swept into a flawless bun, a vision of corporate elegance that clashed with the chaos of their home. Her black leather purse, a luxury item she'd justified with a rare bonus check, dangled from its usual hook in the hall, and David had plunged his hand inside, expecting the familiar jangle of metal. Instead, his fingers grazed a folded slip of paper, its edges worn as if it had been handled too many times. Curiosity, sharp and unbidden, pricked at him. He unfolded it, his breath catching as his eyes scanned the text. Hampton Inn, downtown branch. One night, $189. Check-in, Saturday, 8:42 p.m. Check-out, Sunday, 11:15 a.m. The date stabbed at him. Last weekend, when Anna had claimed a work conference in Cleveland, 3 hours from their quiet cul-de-sac. They hadn't stayed at a hotel together since Emily was a toddler, a fleeting memory of sandy beaches and sunburned shoulders. This receipt, paid in cash no less, wasn't theirs. His pulse quickened, a dull thud against his ribs, as he shoved the paper back into the purse, its weight now a secret pressing against his palm. Anna reappeared in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the dim hall light, her movements brisk as she adjusted her earrings. She was beautiful still, her green eyes sharp with a focus he'd once mistaken for devotion. Her lips painted a soft coral that hadn't faded despite the morning's rush. David's throat tightened, but he swallowed the questions clawing up from his chest, forcing his face into a mask of normalcy. He grabbed his keys from the counter where she'd left them, muttered something about traffic, and pressed a distracted kiss to Sophie's sticky forehead before escaping to the car. The engine rumbled to life, but his thoughts stayed trapped in that receipt, its implications spiraling like smoke he couldn't grasp. The day at the engineering firm passed in a haze, his cubicle a sterile cage of flickering screens and half-finished schematics. He traced lines on blueprints without seeing them, his pencil hovering over equations he couldn't solve, his mind replaying every detail of Anna's story about Cleveland, the late-night packing, the vague updates texted from her phone. She'd come home Sunday afternoon, her suitcase heavier than it should have been, her smile too bright, her hands fluttering as she recounted a dull conference he hadn't asked about. He nodded then, too tired to probe, but now those moments glowed with a sinister edge. By evening, he was back in the kitchen, stirring a pot of mac and cheese as the kids' laughter bounced off the walls, a sound that usually steadied him but now felt like a taunt. Anna swept in later, her purse slung over her shoulder, her makeup refreshed in a way that suggested more than a long day at the office. She poured herself wine, her movements fluid, her presence a quiet storm he couldn't ignore. That night, he lay beside her in their king-sized bed, the mattress sagging under years of shared weight, her breathing soft, and even as if nothing had shifted. The receipt haunted him, a phantom tucked into the folds of her purse, whispering truths he wasn't ready to face. He stared at the ceiling, its cracks mapping a life he'd thought was solid. 14 years with Anna, 3 kids, a house with a leaky faucet, and a mortgage they'd just refinanced. But the cash payment gnawed at him most. Anna hated cash, called it clumsy, always swiped her card with a flourish. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. And as the hours bled into dawn, David's exhaustion hardened into something else. A cold, calculating resolve to uncover what she'd buried, and to make her pay for it. The discovery of the receipt had cracked something open in David, a fissure that widened with every passing hour, letting suspicion seep into the marrow of his once steady existence. The following morning, while the kids shuffled through their routines, Emily tugging on her backpack, Jack spilling cereal, Sophie smearing jam on her cheeks, David lingered in the hall, his eyes fixed on Anna's purse. It hung there, innocuous yet taunting, a Pandora's box he hadn't fully opened. Anna had already left, her car peeling out of the driveway with a haste that felt rehearsed, her excuse about an early meeting ringing hollow in his ears. The house settled into a rare silence after the school bus rumbled away, and David found himself alone with his thoughts, his hands trembling as he reached for the purse again. This time, it wasn't the receipt he sought, but something deeper, proof that the life he'd built with her wasn't a lie. His fingers brushed past the familiar clutter, lipsticks, a crumpled tissue, the receipt still folded like a guilty secret, and settled on something cold and hard at the bottom. A phone, small and cheap, its plastic casing scratched, nothing like the sleek iPhone Anna flaunted daily. His breath hitched, a sharp intake that stung his lungs as he pulled it free, its weight foreign in his palm. He pressed the power button, and the screen flickered to life, revealing a lock screen with no photo, just a plain blue background and a 4-digit passcode prompt. David's mind raced, his engineer's precision kicking in as he tested combinations. Her birthday, their anniversary, the kids' ages, until 12/12, Emily's birth month and day, unlocked it. The simplicity of it stung, a cruel irony that she'd used their daughter's existence to shield her deceit. The messages glowed in stark black text against a white backdrop, a thread labeled simply M. David scrolled, his stomach churning as the words unfurled. Flirty, intimate, possessive. The sender's tone was a hook, and Anna's responses sank it deeper, laced with a warmth he hadn't felt from her in years. Another message, time-stamped from the weekend of the hotel stay, confirmed his worst fear. A room booked, paid in cash, planned with a care she'd never shown him. M was Mark, her boss, the man with the Rolex and the too-white smile, the one she dismissed as a work friend years ago. He sat on the couch, the burner phone cradled in his hands, its cheap plastic warm from his grip. The house around him felt alien now, its walls papered with memories that mocked him. Family photos from vacations, crayon drawings taped to the fridge, the dent in the hallway from Jack's tricycle. 14 years with Anna, 3 kids, a mortgage, and this was where it led. A secret phone, a secret life. His mind, trained to solve problems, to draft blueprints from chaos, began to churn. Confronting her would be too easy, too loud. She'd cry, deny, twist it back on him. No, he needed something sharper, something that cut deeper than words. He slipped the phone back in her purse, exactly as he'd found it, and stood, his legs unsteady but his resolve hardening like steel. The day stretched into evening, the kids tumbling back into the house with their noise and mess, oblivious to the storm brewing in their father's chest. Anna returned late, her heels clicking as she shed her coat, her face a mask of fatigue he no longer believed. She poured her wine, her movements fluid, her eyes avoiding his, and David watched her from the kitchen, stirring pasta with a wooden spoon that trembled in his hand. That night, as she slept beside him, her breathing soft and untroubled, he lay awake, the burner phone's messages replaying in his mind like a blueprint he couldn't erase. Revenge wasn't a word he'd ever applied to himself. He was steady, practical, a fixer, not a destroyer. But as the clock ticked toward dawn, he felt it take shape, a plan as precise as any project he'd engineered, its foundation laid in the betrayal she thought he'd never uncover. David's world had shifted on its axis, the burner phone's revelations anchoring him in a reality he couldn't unsee, a blueprint of betrayal etched into his every thought. The next few days passed in a haze of routine, driving Emily to soccer practice, helping Jack with math homework, tucking Sophie into bed with her stuffed rabbit. But beneath it all, his mind worked tirelessly, drafting a plan as meticulous as the bridges he designed at work. Anna moved through their home like a ghost, her presence a performance he now saw through, her smiles too tight, her excuses too polished. He didn't confront her, didn't let the rage boiling beneath his skin erupt. Instead, he channeled it, his engineer's logic weaving a trap she'd never suspect, a revenge that would test her loyalty and expose her for what she was. It began with a letter, forged with the precision of a man who understood systems and how to break them. He spent a late night at his desk, the house silent save for the hum of his laptop, crafting a document that looked official, bank letterhead, account numbers, a stern warning of a $50,000 debt from a failed investment tied to his name. He printed it on thick paper, stained the edges with coffee to mimic wear, and left it on the kitchen counter where Anna would find it. The next morning, he staged his breakdown, his hands shaking as he paced the room, his voice thick with feigned panic as he explained the crisis to her. She stood by the sink, her coffee mug frozen halfway to her lips, her green eyes narrowing as he rambled about creditors and foreclosure, begging her to help him figure it out. He watched her face, searching for cracks, guilt, fear, anything. But she masked it well, her expression softening into a practiced concern he once would have believed. And it didn't offer solutions right away, her hesitation a thread he tugged at silently. She promised to look into it, her tone vague as she kissed his forehead and left for work, her purse swinging from her shoulder with the burner phone still nestled inside. David waited, his heart a steady drumbeat, knowing she'd turn to Mark, her escape, her savior. He tracked her that evening, not with a car chase, but through the burner phone he'd cloned to his laptop, a trick he'd learned from a tech-savvy coworker years ago. The messages lit up his screen, desperate, pleading, Mark's replies quick and smug. David's lips twitched, not a smile, but a grimace, as he watched her loyalty fracture, her affair now a lifeline she clung to instead of him. The plan deepened over days, each step deliberate. He planted more fake letters, collection notices, a foreclosure warning, scattering them around the house like breadcrumbs, watching Anna's composure fray. She started coming home later, her makeup smudged, her excuses thinner, and David played his part, the desperate husband, clinging to her for salvation. He knew she'd asked Mark for money, the clone text confirming it, $20,000, wired to an account David had set up under a dummy name, a trap she'd never traced back to him. The cash wasn't the point. It was the leverage, the proof she'd choose her lover over their family when push came to shove. By the end of the week, Anna's nerves were raw, her fingers tapping restlessly on the counter as she sipped her wine, her eyes darting to the forged letters David left in plain sight. He watched her unravel, his silence a weapon, his feigned helplessness a mirror she couldn't escape. She didn't know he'd seen the burner phone, didn't know he'd orchestrated this chaos to test her, and that ignorance was his power. The trap was set, the debt of fiction she'd swallowed whole, and as he lay beside her that night, her breathing uneven with unspoken worry, David felt the first stirrings of satisfaction. This wasn't the end. He'd make her lose more than money, more than Mark. He'd dismantle her world as quietly as she'd tried to dismantle his, and she'd never see it coming. David's plan had taken root, its tendrils curling through the cracks in Anna's carefully curated life, and now he watched it bloom with a satisfaction that felt both foreign and intoxicating. The fake debt had her on edge, her green eyes shadowed with a tension she couldn't hide, her fingers twitching as she scrolled her phone. Her real one, not the burner David had already mastered. The cloned messages revealed her desperation, her pleas to Mark growing more frantic as the $20,000 she'd begged from him sat untouched in David's dummy account, a silent trophy of her betrayal. He'd let her stew in the mess he'd crafted, but the next phase was riskier, a move to sever her from her lover entirely, to watch her fall and pretend his hands were clean. His engineer's mind thrived on this. Cause and effect, pressure points collapse. He began with Mark, the man who'd slipped into his life like a thief, all charm and arrogance. David remembered him from that picnic, tall, broad-shouldered, his Rolex glinting in the sun as he clapped David on the back, calling him the family man, with a smirk Anna had laughed off. Now, David studied him from afar, piecing together his weaknesses through late-night searches on his laptop. The kids asleep, the house a cocoon of shadows. Mark's social media was a gallery of excess, yacht trips, steak dinners, a penthouse downtown, and his ego was the chink in his armor. David crafted a new fiction, an email from a concerned colleague, sent from a burner account, warning Mark that Anna was playing him, that she'd bragged about draining his bank account to save her pathetic husband. He attached a forged screenshot of a text, Anna's words, twisted to sound callous, and hit send, his pulse steady as he watched the bait sink into Mark's inbox. The fallout came fast. David tracked it through the burner phone's messages, his laptop screen glowing in the dark as Anna's text to Mark shifted from flirty to frantic. Mark's replies turned cold, accusing, then silent. She'd met him at a bar downtown, expecting cash and comfort, only to face a tirade David could almost hear through the screen. He'd planted more seeds earlier that day, a fake delivery to Mark's office with a note implying Anna had sent it, a cheap bouquet, and a card reading "Thank for the loan, sucker," and the combination hit its mark. Mark's pride couldn't take it. He cut her off, his final message a venomous dismissal. Anna's responses spiraled into pleas, then nothing. The silence a victory David savored as he sat in his recliner, the house creaking around him. She came home that night, her coat damp with rain, her makeup streaked in a way she'd never let him see before. David stirred soup on the stove, the kids' laughter drifting from the living room where they watched cartoons, and he glanced at her. Her shoulders slumped, her purse clutched like a lifeline. He didn't ask, didn't need to. The clone text had painted the scene already. Mark was gone, her escape route severed, and she'd run back to the family she'd betrayed, her face a mask of defeat he pretended not to notice. He ladled soup into bowls, his movements deliberate, his silence a wall she couldn't breach. She hovered near the counter, her fingers tracing the edge of a forged debt letter he'd left there, her breathing shallow, as if she might confess. But she didn't, and he didn't push. His revenge was a slow burn, and this was just the ember catching. The days that followed were a study in her unraveling. Anna's poise crumbled, her heels traded for flats, her wine glasses left half empty as she stared into space, her mind clearly replaying Mark's rejection. David watched it all, his mask of concern flawless, his hands busy with the kids, helping Emily with a science project, building Lego forts with Jack, reading to Sophie until her eyelids drooped. He was the steady one now, the anchor she'd forgotten he could be, and she clung to it, her touch hesitant when she brushed his arm, her eyes searching for something he wouldn't give. The affair was dead, marked a ghost she couldn't resurrect, and David felt the weight of his triumph settle into his bones. But it wasn't enough, not yet. He'd taken her lover, her pride. Next, he'd take her illusions, and when the final piece fell, she'd see the wreckage he'd built from the ashes of her lies. David's victory over Mark was a quiet detonation, its shockwaves rippling through Anna's life while he stood at the epicenter, untouched and calculating, his revenge now a structure half-built, waiting for its final supports. She'd come back to him, her affair in ruins, her green eyes dulled by a defeat she couldn't name, and he'd welcomed her with a warmth that was all surface, a facade as carefully engineered as the debt letters still scattered across their home. The kids filled the house with their chaos. Emily's soccer cleats thudding against the floor, Jack's laughter erupting over a spilled juice carton, Sophie's crayons rolling under the couch, and David moved through it like a shadow, his hands busy, his heart a vault she couldn't crack. He'd severed her from Mark, but the real dismantling was just beginning, a slow withdrawal she'd feel before she understood. He started with the money, the $20,000 she'd begged from her lover and now sitting in his dummy account, a secret he guarded as he opened another, a real one, this time under his name alone. Late at night, while Anna slept fitfully beside him, her breathing jagged with unspoken regrets, he siphoned fun from their joint savings, small amounts she wouldn't notice, building a nest egg for the life he'd claim without her. His laptop glowed in the dark, its screen a map of his escape. Bank transfers, apartment listings, school districts an hour away where the kids could start fresh. He didn't rush. Haste was her mistake, not his. Every move was measured, a blueprint drawn in the silence of a house that no longer felt like home. The kids became his shield and his purpose, their routines a rhythm he leaned into as he pulled away from her. He enrolled Emily in a weekend art class, her sketches of lopsided houses now taped to his office wall instead of the fridge Anna ignored. Jack joined a robotics club, his chatter about circuits filling the car rides David now took alone, leaving Anna to her late nights at the office, or wherever she went, pretending normalcy. Sophie's bedtime stories stretched longer, her tiny hand clutching his as he read about dragons and castles, her giggles a balm against the coldness growing inside him. Anna noticed the shift, her brow furrowing when he left the room as she entered, her touch lingering when he shrugged it off, but he offered nothing. No anger, no warmth, just a stillness that unnerved her more than any fight could. She tried to bridge the gap, her efforts clumsy against his indifference. One evening, she lingered in the kitchen, her blouse wrinkled from a day she didn't explain, her fingers twisting a wine glass as he wiped the counter, his movements mechanical. Her hair fell loose, a strand catching the light, and for a moment he remembered the girl she'd been. Wild, ambitious, his partner in a life they'd dreamed up together. But the memory soured, tainted by the burner phone, the hotel receipt, the lies she'd spun while he'd built their world. She reached for him, her hand brushing his arm, and he stepped back, his face blank as he turned to the sink, leaving her stranded in the space he'd vacated. Her breathing hitched, a sound he ignored, and she retreated to the couch, her silhouette small against the cushions, a stranger in their shared history. The days bled into weeks, and his presence a fading echo as David constructed his new reality. He toured an apartment on his lunch break, its bare walls a promise of freedom, its rent covered by the money he'd stashed. He met with a lawyer, a discreet consultation over coffee, mapping custody and assets with a calm he hadn't expected. The kids thrived, their laughter a lifeline, and he fed it, trips to the park, ice cream runs, moments Anna missed as she clung to a job she thought defined her. She sensed the drift, her eyes searching his over dinner, her fork pushing food she didn't eat, but he gave her nothing to hold on to. His revenge wasn't in the affair's end or the money he'd tricked her into losing. It was in this, the slow erasure of their bond, the life he'd reclaim without her. And as he lay awake that night, her body a distant weight beside him, he knew the final blow was near, a revelation that would topple the last of her illusions and set him free. David's plan had reached its crescendo, a structure of revenge so finely tuned that every beam and bolt aligned with devastating precision. And now he stood on the edge of its unveiling, his heart a steady pulse beneath the calm he'd worn like armor. Anna drifted through their home, a ghost of the woman he'd married, her green eyes hollowed by the weeks of his silent retreat, her hands restless as she clutched her wine glass or smoothed her hair, gestures of a life unraveling she couldn't stop. The kids were his world now, their routines a fortress he'd built brick by brick. Emily's art pinned to his desk, Jack's robot blueprints scattered across the dining table, Sophie's stuffed rabbit tucked under his arm as he read her sleep. Anna hovered on the periphery, her attempts to reconnect met with his indifference, a wall she battered against without knowing why. But the time for pretense was over. The truth he'd hoarded was a hammer, and he was ready to swing. It happened on a Friday evening, the air thick with the promise of rain, the house quiet after he'd dropped the kids at a neighbor's for a sleepover, a calculated move to clear the stage. Anna sat on the couch, her legs curled beneath her, a half-empty bottle of Merlot on the coffee table, its dark stains spreading across a coaster like blood. David stood in the kitchen doorway, his hands in his pockets, the forged debt letters gathered in a neat stack beside him. their edges worn from weeks of manipulation. He'd packed a bag already, tucked in the trunk of his car, an overnight duffel for him, backpacks for the kids, a new chapter folded into canvas and zippers. Anna looked up as he approached, her face softening with a hope he'd soon crush. And he felt no guilt, only the cold clarity of a man who'd seen too much. He began with the debt, his voice low, and even as he slid the letters across the table, their official seals glinting under the lamplight. He told her it was a lie, a fiction he'd spun from nothing. $50,000 of imaginary ruin, a test she'd failed the moment she turned to Mark instead of him. Her eyes widened, the wine glass trembling in her hand as the words sank in, her mind racing to catch up with a betrayal she hadn't seen coming. He didn't pause, didn't soften the blow. He pulled the burner phone from his pocket, its scratched plastic a relic of her secrets, and set it beside the letters, its screen dark, but its history alive in his memory. He recounted the messages, every flirtation, every promise, every lie she'd typed to Mark while he'd slept beside her, trusting her. Her face crumpled, the coral lipstick smearing as she pressed her lips together, her breathing shallow gasps that filled the silence he left for her to drown in. She didn't deny it, couldn't. Her guilt was a weight she'd carried too long, and now it pinned her to the couch, her shoulders slumping as he laid bare the affair, the hotel, the cash she'd thought hid her tracks. He told her about Mark's fall, the emails and deliveries he'd engineered, the $20,000 she'd begged for now locked in an account she'd never touch. Each revelation was a brick pulled from the foundation of her world, and she watched it collapse, her hands clawing at the cushions as if they could hold her upright. David stood still, his face a mask, his eyes tracing the woman he'd loved until she'd become a stranger. Her beauty faded, her ambition a hollow shell, her pride dust at his feet. He finished with the simplest truth. He was leaving, taking the kids, starting over without her. The bag was already in the car, the apartment leased, the lawyer's papers drafted, details he didn't share as he turned away, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood. Anna's silhouette blurred in his periphery, her form small and broken against the couch, a tableau of regret he'd never unsee but wouldn't carry. He stepped into the night, the rain starting as he climbed into his car, the engine's rumble a steady heartbeat against the storm. The kids waited at the neighbors, their lives uprooted but safe in his hands, and as he drove away, the house shrank in his rear view, a relic of a life he'd outgrown. Anna was alone now. Her illusions shattered, her betrayal a mirror she couldn't escape, and David felt the weight lift, the final piece of his revenge locking into place as he turned toward freedom. David's departure was a clean break, a line drawn in the sand of a life he'd dismantled with the precision of an engineer tearing down a flawed design. And now he stood on the other side, the pieces of his new world falling into place with a quiet grace he hadn't expected. The apartment smelled of fresh paint and possibility, its bare walls a canvas for the kids. Emily's sketches taped crookedly above the couch, Jack's Lego towers rising on the coffee table, Sophie's crayons staining the linoleum with bursts of color. The rain had followed him that first night, drumming against the windows as he unpacked their bags, his hands steady despite the ache in his chest, a hollow space where Anna's presence had once fit. He didn't look back, didn't linger on the house he'd left her in. His focus was forward, his revenge complete, not in her ruin, but in his rebirth. The kids adapted faster than he'd feared, their resilience a lifeline he clung to as he rebuilt their routines. Emily threw herself into her art classes, her pencil strokes bolder now, her silence less sullen as she sketched bridges David recognized from his own work. Jack's robotics club became his kingdom, his small hands wiring circuits with a focus that mirrored David's own, their evenings filled with talk of gears and motors instead of the tension that had once choked their home. Sophie clung to him most, her tiny arms wrapping around his neck as he carried her to bed, her stuffed rabbit a constant companion in a world she didn't fully understand. They asked about Anna sometimes, soft questions about when she'd visit, why she wasn't there, and David answered gently, his words vague but firm. She needed time. They needed this. He didn't poison them against her. His victory, didn't require that. It was enough that they were his, their laughter a sound she'd lost the right to share. His days found a new rhythm, the engineering firm a steady anchor as he poured himself into projects, his desk cluttered with blueprints and coffee cups, his mind sharper without the fog of betrayal. He'd kept the $20,000, a practical spoil of war, using it to cushion the move, furniture, school fees, a bike for Jack that gleamed red in the sunlight. The lawyer finalized the divorce papers weeks later, a quiet meeting in a sterile office where David signed his name with a hand that didn't shake, the custody agreement granting him the kids, and his absence from the process a surrender he hadn't needed to fight for. She'd called once, her voice thinned through the phone, a plea he'd cut short with a promise to arrange visits when she was ready. She wasn't. Her silence since then told him that. And he didn't chase it, didn't need her remorse to feel whole. And his fate filtered back to him through fragments, coworkers' gossip, a mutual friend's awkward update over coffee. She'd stayed in the house, its mortgage a burden she couldn't shed, her job slipping as her focus frayed, her nights spent alone with the wine she'd once poured so casually. Mark had vanished from her orbit, his pride too bruised to forgive her, and she'd unraveled without the crutches of her affair or David's steadiness. He pictured her there, her blonde hair lank, her green eyes staring at the debt letters he'd left behind, their falsity a wound she couldn't heal. It wasn't cruelty that painted the image, just distance, a man observing a life he'd escaped, its wreckage a testament to her choices, not his hands. David's new dawn was quieter, softer, a life stripped of her shadow and rebuilt in the light of his kids' resilience. He took them to the park on weekends, their shouts echoing as they raced across grass still wet with dew, his laughter mingling with theirs in a way it hadn't in years. He cooked dinners, burnt pancakes, lumpy pasta, his hands learning what his heart already knew. He was enough for them, more than she'd ever been. The apartment grew into a home, its corners filled with their mess, its silence a peace he'd earned. One night, as Sophie slept against his chest, her breathing a steady hum, he looked out at the city lights beyond the window, their glow a map of a future he'd charted alone. Anna was a memory now, her betrayal a scar that had toughened him, her ruin a price she'd paid without him lifting a finger beyond the truth. His revenge was this, his strength, his family, his freedom. And as the stars blinked through the haze, David closed his eyes, the weight of his triumph settling into a calm he'd never known he could claim.